Don't show this to your son. Not yet. Especially not to his wife. That was the first thing my wife's lawyer said to me the morning after we buried her. I was standing in my kitchen in Barrie, still wearing the same dark suit from the day before, a cold cup of coffee in my hand, when my phone rang at 7:53 in the morning. I almost didn't answer. I thought it would be another neighbor calling to say they were sorry, that she was a wonderful woman, that I was in their prayers. I'd heard it 40 times in the past 3 days, and every time it felt like a door closing on a room I wasn't ready to leave. But I answered, and what I heard on the other end of that line changed everything I thought I knew about the last 4 years of my life. My wife and I had been married for 38 years. We met at a community center dance in Sudbury in the winter of 1986. She was wearing a red wool sweater and laughing at something her friend had said, and I remember thinking that whoever made her laugh like that was the luckiest person in the room. A year later, that person was me. We moved to Barrie in 1994 when I took a position with an engineering firm, bought a 2-story house on a quiet street near Kempenfelt Bay, and built what I thought was a solid, ordinary, beautiful life. We had one son. He was 34 now. My wife was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in January of the year before she died. She fought it the way she did, everything quietly, without complaint, and with a stubbornness that her oncologist at Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre said he rarely saw in patients. She had good months and hard months. She kept a vegetable garden in the backyard until July. She lost her hair in August and made a joke about finally having an excuse to buy better hats. By October, the cancer had spread. By November, she was gone. I thought I understood grief. I had lost my parents, my older brother, friends over the years. But nothing prepares you for the specific silence of a house where your person used to be. The first night after the funeral, I sat in her armchair in the living room and didn't move until the sun came up. I wasn't crying. I was just sitting there, listening to a silence that felt like it had weight. That was when the phone rang. My wife's lawyer introduced himself, though I already knew who he was. My wife had retained him 2 years earlier to update her will. He said he was sorry for my loss. And then he said the thing I quoted at the beginning, the thing that made my hand tighten around the phone until my knuckles went white. Don't show this to your son. Not yet. Especially not to his wife. Show me what? I asked. He said there was a letter. My wife had given it to him 6 weeks before she passed. He called it a sealed instruction letter. Something she had requested be kept separate from the will and delivered to me privately. After the service, when I was alone, he said she had been very specific about the timing. She didn't want me to have it while I was grieving publicly. She wanted me to have it when I was quiet. I asked him what was in it. He said he didn't know the full contents. That was the truth of a sealed letter. The lawyer held it but didn't read it. What he did know was that my wife had also made several significant changes to her estate documents in the weeks before she wrote that letter. Changes that her son and daughter-in-law were not aware of. Changes that, he said carefully, she had made with full mental capacity and a clear intention to protect certain assets. Protect them from what? I wanted to ask. From whom? He said he thought it would be better if I read the letter first. He could bring it to me that morning if I was willing. He said he understood it was the day after her funeral and that he wouldn't blame me if I needed time, but that my wife had specifically asked him not to delay. I told him to come. He arrived at 9. He was a composed, silver-haired man in his 60s, the kind of person who chose his words the way a careful carpenter chooses wood. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, declined the coffee I offered, and placed a white envelope in front of me. My wife's handwriting was on the front, just my name. Nothing else. He gave me privacy to read it. I sat alone in my kitchen with that envelope for almost 2 minutes before I could open it. Her handwriting was shaky. She had written it when her hands were already unsteady, but every word was deliberate. I could feel her in every sentence. That particular way she had of saying hard things gently, like she was handing you something fragile and watching to see if you'd hold it right. She had started to suspect something was wrong 14 months before she died. It had started small. A phone call she overheard between our son and his wife, a conversation about the cottage. We had a property in Muskoka, a piece of land her parents had left her, with a modest cabin on it that we'd added to over the years. It was worth considerably more than when her parents bought it, the way Muskoka properties tend to be now. She had always planned to leave it to our son, with the understanding that it would stay in the family and that I would have use of it for the rest of my life. What she heard on that phone call was her daughter-in-law telling our son that the cottage could be sold quickly if they listed it as soon as possible after the estate cleared probate, that the market was good, that they shouldn't wait. My wife wrote that she had told herself it was nothing, that she'd misunderstood, that people say things they don't mean when they're anxious about money. And she knew our son and his wife had been struggling. They'd bought a house in Mississauga at the top of the market 2 years before, and the carrying costs were punishing them. She gave them the benefit of the doubt. But then other things started happening. She began noticing that her daughter-in-law was unusually curious about finances, about my pension, about what the house in Barrie was worth, about whether I had a financial power of attorney in place. She asked once casually, over dinner, whether my wife and I had ever talked about downsizing, and whether we'd considered moving somewhere smaller to free up capital. At the time, I had been the one to answer, and I'd said I liked our house and hadn't thought about it. I hadn't thought anything of the question. I was remembering it now, sitting in my kitchen with my dead wife's letter in my hands, and realizing I had misread what was in front of me. There was more. Approximately 10 months before my wife died, her daughter-in-law had come to the house while I was at a physio appointment and my wife was resting. She had brought flowers, which my wife appreciated. She had also brought a document. She told my wife it was a form for a joint account she and our son wanted to set up, so that they could help manage finances more easily during my wife's illness. She said it would make things simpler for everyone, that they just needed my wife's signature on a few places. My wife had asked to read it first. Her daughter-in-law had said it was straightforward, just a standard banking form, nothing complicated. She had been pleasant about it, but my wife noticed that she kept the document angled slightly away, kept redirecting attention to the flowers, kept speaking quickly in a way that didn't invite careful reading. My wife had said she'd prefer to look it over with me first. Her daughter-in-law had smiled and said, of course. No rush at all. She had taken the document with her when she left. My wife never saw it again. No one mentioned it again. But after that visit, she called her lawyer. She didn't tell me any of this while she was alive. I read her explanation for that twice because I needed to understand it. She wrote that she didn't want to damage my relationship with our son. She knew how much I loved him. She knew that if I found out what his wife had been doing, I would confront her immediately, and that the confrontation would push our son to defend his wife rather than question her, and that it would turn the last months of her life into a war she didn't have the energy to fight. She chose instead to do what she could do quietly. She changed her will. She moved certain assets. She wrote the letter. She wanted me to know the truth after she was gone, when she wasn't there to worry about the fallout. She wanted me to protect myself. And she wanted me to know that none of this was my son's fault. She believed he didn't fully understand what his wife was doing, or had convinced himself it was harmless. She asked me to be careful with him. She closed the letter the way she always ended, serious conversations. Practically, with love, and then one dry remark at the end so I wouldn't sit in the dark too long. I read the whole thing twice. Then I set it on the table and looked out the kitchen window at her vegetable garden, which was brown and frozen at the edges now in the November cold, and I let myself feel everything I needed to feel for the next 10 minutes. Then I called her lawyer back in. I needed to understand what she had changed in the will. He walked me through it carefully. The cottage in Muskoka had been removed from the joint estate and placed in a trust structured so that I had full lifetime use of the property, and that it would transfer to our son only upon my death, with a clear legal restriction preventing sale or transfer during my lifetime without my written consent. My wife's TFSA and a non-registered investment account, which together amounted to a sum that I had known about in general terms but not in specific detail, had been directed entirely to me, rather than split with our son, as the previous will had outlined. She had also, the lawyer told me, documented her concerns in a sworn affidavit prepared by his office not for immediate use, but as a record, in case anything happened that required it. She had been protecting me from inside a hospital room while I was sitting beside her watching television and thinking she was just resting. The lawyer advised me not to say anything to our son or his wife until the estate had cleared probate and the new will was filed. He said it would take several months. He said in the meantime, I should be careful about signing anything, agreeing to anything financial, or allowing any changes to my own accounts or powers of attorney without consulting him first. He left me his direct line and told me to call if I was approached. I thanked him. He shook my hand at the door, and I noticed he held it a moment longer than a formal handshake requires, the way people do when they know you're about to carry something heavy. My son and his wife came over for dinner 3 nights later. I had made the kind of meal I always made when I needed to feel normal: roast chicken, roasted potatoes, the green beans from the garden that I'd frozen in September. My daughter-in-law brought wine. She was warm and solicitous, helped clear the table, asked how I was sleeping, whether I needed anything. My son sat across from me with a look. I recognized the look he'd had as a boy when he was sad but didn't know how to say it. I focused on that. I tried to hold what my wife had written. She believed he didn't fully understand. After dinner, while my son was in the bathroom, my daughter-in-law asked if I'd had a chance to look through the paperwork from the estate. She said it so gently, so practically, the way you'd ask someone if they'd remembered to pick up milk. She said she knew it was overwhelming, and that she and my son wanted to help, and that if it would be easier, she had a contact, a financial advisor she trusted, who could sit with me and walk through things. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about my wife, shaky-handed, writing by lamplight in her hospital room. I said I had a lawyer handling everything and that I was in good hands. She nodded and said that was wonderful, and changed the subject. The months that followed were strange. Probate in Ontario takes time. The will had to be filed. The estate administration had to move through its process. And during that period, I was largely left to manage my life quietly. My son called twice a week. His wife called less often. When she did call, the conversation always arrived eventually at finances, at how I was managing, at whether the house felt too big, at whether I'd thought about my own long-term plans. I kept my answers short and warm. I said I was taking things one step at a time. I said my wife's lawyer was very capable. I did not tell them what was coming. There was one evening in February, about 3 months after the funeral, that I almost broke. My son came alone. His wife was visiting her mother, and we sat in the living room after dinner, and he talked about my wife in a way he hadn't been able to at the funeral, about things she'd taught him, about how she used to pack his lunch with a note inside every single day until he was in grade 8 and told her to stop, and how he regretted telling her to stop, about how he didn't know how to be without her. I sat and listened, and I thought about what my wife had written, that she believed in him, that she thought if he knew what his wife had been doing, he would be horrified. I wanted to tell him everything right then. I genuinely considered it, but I remembered what my wife had asked me. She had thought it through more carefully than I had. She had been living with this knowledge for over a year. She had made a choice about timing, and she had asked me to respect it. So I kept listening, and when he left that night, I stood at the front door and watched his taillights disappear down the street, and I went back inside, and I sat in her armchair again, and I made a decision. I was going to trust her judgment one more time. The letter from the estate lawyer came in April. It informed all beneficiaries of the contents of the will, as required by Ontario probate law. My son received his copy. His wife received hers alongside it, as she was copied as his spouse. My son called me 20 minutes after I assumed the letters arrived. He wasn't angry. He was confused. He said he didn't understand. He thought the cottage was going to come to him. He thought the investment accounts were going to be split. He said he wasn't upset. He just didn't understand, because his mother had always said. I told him I knew what his mother had always said, and I told him that she had changed her mind, and that she had put her reasons in writing, and that I had something I needed to show him. I asked him to come alone. He paused on the phone. I think he understood in that pause that something significant had shifted. He said he'd be there Saturday morning. His wife called 3 hours later. Her tone was different from any conversation we'd had since the funeral. There was an edge to it now, something precise and controlled, like she was picking her words with great care. She said she was sure there was an explanation, that she wasn't questioning my wife's intentions, but that the will seemed unusual, and she wondered if perhaps it had been drafted when my wife wasn't fully herself. She used the phrase cognitive capacity. She said it gently, but she said it clearly. I told her I had my wife's lawyer's full assessment of her mental capacity at the time of the signing, a sworn statement from 2 witnesses, and a notarized physician's letter. I told her that I appreciated her concern and that I would be speaking with my son on Saturday. She said she'd like to be there too. I said Saturday was for my son. She came anyway. I opened the door Saturday morning, and they were both standing there. My daughter-in-law was smiling that particular smile that doesn't involve the eyes. My son looked like he hadn't slept well. I stepped back and let them both in. I didn't say anything about it. I just went to the kitchen table, where I had set out the letter, the will documentation, and the affidavit my wife had prepared. I poured coffee. I sat down, and I told my son to read the letter first. I slid it across the table to him. He read it slowly. His wife leaned in. He angled it slightly so she could see a gesture so automatic between married people that I don't think he even noticed he did it. I watched his face change as he read, the confusion giving way to something else, something harder. When he finished, he set it down on the table. He looked at his wife. She had her expression fully under control. She said my wife had been very ill and under a lot of stress. She said people sometimes become confused about what they perceived and what actually happened. She said the document she'd brought to the house that day had been nothing, just a form she'd thought might help, and she'd dropped the idea immediately when my wife asked. My son was still looking at her. I placed the affidavit in front of him. It detailed the document his wife had brought to the house, the date, the nature of the form. It had not been a banking form. It had been a partial power of attorney document. My wife had managed to read enough of it to understand what it was before her daughter-in-law angled it away. My son read the affidavit. Then he looked at his wife again. She said my wife had misunderstood, that she would never. He asked her to stop talking. The kitchen was very quiet for a long moment. Outside, a cardinal was sitting on the feeder my wife had put up near the window 3 winters ago. I found myself watching it. My son asked me what I needed from him. I told him I didn't need anything from him. I told him his mother had already taken care of everything. I told him that the cottage would come to him when I was gone, that I had no intention of selling it, and that what I needed him to understand was what had been happening in his own house without his knowledge. I told him I wasn't angry at him. I told him his mother wasn't angry at him either. She'd said so, explicitly, in the letter he was holding. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth and looked at the table. His wife tried once more to speak. She reached toward him, put her hand on his arm, began to say something about how this wasn't fair, how she'd been nothing but supportive during such a difficult time. He stood up from the table. He picked up the letter. He looked at his wife for a long moment with an expression I didn't fully understand, and maybe didn't need to. Then he walked to the back door and stood outside on the porch in the April cold without his coat. I let him stand there. I went and refilled my coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the brown remnants of the garden. His wife sat at the table alone. After a while, she picked up her purse. She said nothing to me as she walked to the front door. I heard it close behind her. I brought my son a jacket and 2 cups of coffee, and we stood on the porch together in the cold for a long time without talking. The bay was visible between the houses at the end of the street, still showing patches of ice at the edges in the April morning. He asked me how long I had known. I told him since the morning after the funeral. He was quiet with that for a while. He asked why I hadn't told him sooner. I told him his mother had asked me not to, that she had her reasons, and that I had trusted her judgment. He nodded slowly. He looked out at the bay. He said that sounded like her. I said it did. What followed was not a clean or simple resolution. I want to be honest about that, because stories that tie up too perfectly tend to be the ones that feel false. And this one is true. My son and his wife did not separate immediately. He moved into the spare room at a friend's house in Barrie for 2 weeks, during which he called me every second day and didn't say much on any of those calls. Just checked in the way you do when you need to know someone is still there. His wife retained her own lawyer. There were some uncomfortable months while they worked through what a separation would look like and what it wouldn't. The police became involved in the spring, not at my insistence, but after my wife's lawyer filed a formal complaint with the relevant authorities regarding the attempted misuse of a power of attorney document. In Ontario, attempting to fraudulently obtain financial control over a vulnerable person is taken seriously. An investigation was opened. My daughter-in-law was ultimately charged under the Criminal Code of Canada with 1 count of attempted fraud over $5,000 and 1 count related to the attempted misuse of a financial document. Her lawyer argued the charges were overstated. The Crown disagreed. She was convicted and sentenced to a period of probation with conditions, along with community service and a court-ordered repayment into a victim compensation fund, a sentence that some might call lenient and that I made my peace with. because the thing I cared most about was the record, the fact that it was documented, the fact that she could not now, in any future context, deny that it had happened. My son was not charged with anything. The investigation confirmed what my wife had suspected, that he had been largely unaware of the specific scheme his wife had pursued. He had signed some documents he hadn't read carefully enough, which was its own kind of failing, and one he had to sit with. But there was no criminal intent found on his part. He has been living in Barrie again since the summer, in a small apartment near the college. We have dinner on Sundays when he can make it. He is learning to cook. He made a credible attempt at pot roast last month that he was unreasonably proud of, and I told him so, and I meant it as a compliment. The cottage in Muskoka is still there. I opened it up for the first time since my wife passed this last summer, drove up in June when the highway wasn't yet too crowded, took the key from its hook in the garage, pushed open the door that always sticks in the humidity. Everything was the same as we'd left it. Her rain jacket was still hanging on the peg by the back door. Her books were stacked on the windowsill with receipts and grocery lists tucked inside as bookmarks the way she always did. I sat on the dock in the evening and watched the light go off the water the way it does up there in the summer. That particular gold that you can't reproduce anywhere else, and I thought about the letter she'd written, about the shaky handwriting, about the fact that she had spent some of her last energy on this, not because she was afraid of losing the cottage or the money, but because she was afraid of me being alone and vulnerable and without anyone looking out for me. She looked out for me the only way she could. I keep the letter in the top drawer of my desk now. I don't read it often, but I know it's there. There's something people don't tell you about getting older, or maybe they tell you and you don't fully understand it until you're living it. You can do everything right. You can build a life carefully, love the right people, work hard, save well, stay honest, and it still may not protect you from someone who has decided that your comfort is less important than their ambition, that your trust is a resource to be managed, that your age makes you soft enough to lean on. I am 67 years old. I own my house outright. I have a pension from 30 years in engineering. I have a cottage in Muskoka that I intend to use every summer for as long as I can drive to it. I have a son who is learning, slowly, how to reckon with a hard truth about his own choices. And I have a lawyer on speed dial who I fully intend to call before I sign anything, ever, for the rest of my life. I also have a red armchair in my living room that still smells, faintly, like her. I sit in it sometimes in the evenings with a book I'm not really reading, and I think about that winter dance in Sudbury in 1986, and the red wool sweater, and the laugh. You don't owe anyone your peace of mind, not your home, not your savings, not your future, not even the people you love most, because love, real love, does not ask you to disappear into it. My wife knew that. She protected me even from a hospital room because she understood something that took me longer to learn. The people who truly love you will never ask you to sign something you haven't read. They will never rush you. They will never use your grief against you. They will write you a letter with shaky handwriting and ask a careful man to deliver it at the right moment, and they will trust you to do the rest. Take care of yourself. Tell someone you trust about anything that doesn't feel right. No signature is ever too small to matter. And if something doesn't feel right, trust that feeling. My wife did. It saved both of us,